Thank you very much for all the voting and stuff. Morning. Trying to get some titles today.
The heck is that?
I don't feel it.
Probably.
Okay, I think we'll get going here. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are holding this meeting on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular, acknowledge our special relationships with the Katzie, Kwantlen, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo First Nations. So with that, I'd like to call the special meeting for Township Council for budget purposes to order. Could I get a motion to adopt the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Pratt. Just show of hands, all in favor? Great. Anyone opposed? Great, that's carried. So we'll carry on with straight to it. B1, draft 2023 budget presentation. Ms. Ruff, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll just give a few introductory comments that may assist in terms of trying to streamline the process, because even with the reduced paper we're trying to provide, it still is a daunting amount of work that has to be done for a budget and the material that has to be gone through. If one looks in their package at the council priority projects, you'll see a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet lists what we believe to be the council priority projects for, well, not just this year, but for this term. And as well, it provides some envelopes, and I'll emphasize that these are not estimates, but merely budget envelopes for the projects. Where we have numbers, we've taken them from the CAC bylaw we recently adopted. Where we don't, we've taken them from historical studies or anything that we may have that's relevant. I emphasize their envelopes only for the purpose of saying more work must be done. As we go through them, though, what becomes apparent is that we likely have a lot more, priorities or hopes than we may have resources. And that means that we may have to prioritize, or it means we have to look at other options in terms of, coordinating, presenting over time, or as well looking at other creative ways rather than simply, raising revenue, but also looking at reducing expenses. So those are part of the initiatives we have to undertake, and that sets a bit of the scene for this program here today. And I say that because as we look at some of the numbers you've seen in the package, these are very much a work in progress. What we are looking to do is to actually come up with some envelopes or some direction that will allow us to say we can further advance this, but keep in mind the bigger objective. In many ways, 2003 will be easier, 2023 will be easier than 2024 will be as we start to roll on some of the projects, but we think there is certainly an opportunity to do so, provided we're cognizant of some of the challenges that we have to look at. As we look at the list, we recognize that when we look at our possible sources for these projects, such as community amenity contributions, such as redirecting carry forwards, such as taking existing capital projects, reprioritizing them, there still is going to be a gap, and that gap will likely have to be carried through either through township resources reserves, which we'll certainly utilize, or as well through township borrowing. And we think it's important because of the changing economic climate to establish that we want to proceed with the borrowing and recognize what the impact of that will be in subsequent to years. Now, to do so means that borrowing is fairly easy. The question with borrowing is always, and when one looks at that to achieve the priorities, what's the cost of that borrowing and what's the impact of that going to be over a number of years? Well, we think it's twofold. We think, number one, of course, we want to raise revenue, and the community amenity contribution program will certainly do that in part, but we also think we have to create some envelopes for spending or spending reductions or realignments or reprioritizations or reclassifications within the existing organization itself. And that's just part of the renewal process the organization should go through every 4 years in any event. So with that then, what we're looking at from council is to look at the materials with a bit of a jaundiced eye and to the best they can say, okay, well, you know, these are our priorities that we should be addressing, certainly, maybe split the priorities here, maybe not, or more importantly, maybe there's some service items that we're providing out there that really aren't as relevant as they once were. I'm relatively satisfied that from our existing complement, there is always more efficiencies that can be obtained, but they're not going to come anywhere near, I think, the efficiencies we would need to achieve our overall objectives. So that means we have to look at other ways of attaining the revenues to do so. And through efficiencies being one step, we have a certain number of hours of work we must do to keep the organization functioning from the existing capacity. There's always some, but it's not going to be anywhere near in terms of trying to achieve some of the objectives we've set here today. So with that in mind, then we're looking at areas, perhaps it's not a matter of simply adding more, work to the existing, staff load, but instead changing what that work is. And there may be opportunities here to say, well, there's some things that were very important 25 years ago that maybe are no longer relevant or topical, and those are things that we're going to be trying to elicit from council as best we can. We don't have a defined outcome. We're not looking at a specific resolution or recommendation at this point. We're trying to get feedback as best we can, a broad base of feedback that'll allow us to make this process go smoothly forward, we hope, and try to streamline it as we've tried to do so far. Sandra, is that a sufficient introduction?
Yeah, that's great. So I want to stress here, I've got one speaker as well, so I want to stress as well, Mr. Back, and this would be today's purpose is to get the information to council, review it, and then there's still some time to consider options, digest the information. I'm also going to have it, so when slides come forward, please request to speak and ask questions as the slides are there. Of course, we can always go back, but feel free to answer questions, ask questions as we go along. Councillor Richter.
Yes, so Mr. Backen, I just want to clarify the council priorities projects that are here. Council never did have a priorities planning session this year, which is a deviation from past practice where we had those priority setting sessions every year at the start of a term. So where exactly did these come from?
No, thank you. Good question. We've derived these from the discussions we've heard through the election process and from council comments themselves. I think it's a fair comment that we should also look at these priorities in terms of, are there things here that the council thinks we've missed the boat on? There may be things that don't belong here. There may be some things that should be added to these. These are things that have come from, for example, the CAC bylaw that was recently passed that provided us with some direction on these issues, but there's many issues here that again, as I say, may warrant prioritization or may warrant deferral if that's council's desire.
Yeah, I would also add, Mr. Bracken, that there were motions adopted by council in November outlining these projects as priorities of council, approved by council. Anything else, Councillor Richter?
No, but I just wanted to make it clear that this was not there was no pre-priority planning session this term so far. The second comment or question that I had about these council priority projects, which ones are critical? Do we have a listing of, are they a 1, a 2, or a 3?
So thank you for the question. There's actually a good commentary that we should talk about just briefly on projects generally. When you look at this package, you'll notice that we still have work to do in the context of looking at the carry forwards, and I touched upon it, our capital priorities themselves. We are looking at our existing, I guess, traditional approach to the budget and are looking at the ranking system we have to determine which priorities are important from a health and safety perspective, those being the critical priorities. That isn't yet here, but we'll be looking at that in some detail with the definition of critical being those that have an immediate and potential impact, an immediate impact on health and safety potentially within the next 12 months, so that it's something that has to be dealt with, can't be put over. That's a bit different than our previous directions, which have been more strategic, but we're looking at that for the purpose of looking at these council priority projects to create some window or some envelope that these can be looked at. These projects, by and large, are going to be considered new projects, save and except for some of the road issues. It'll be council's decision as to whether these are a priority or a critical priority or whatnot. These are, by and large, new facilities that are looked at. So as such, they would be determined by council as to their priority, not by staff.
Okay, and the third comment that I have, and you had said, were there things that we're doing that maybe we no longer need to do? A question I have, and maybe we could flag it for the process. Several years ago, the decision was made by the council of the day to start making signs in-house. Is that still a cost-effective measure, or is that something that could be outsourced?
We'd have to look at that study and determine what the outcome of it was and what the present market conditions are. In some situations, we're seeing that the market is challenging because of the supply chain, and we are in many situations better to do what we can with our own resources. From a timing perspective, it may have a slight change implication on the cost, but we're very cognizant of that. But that's something we can come back to you with in terms of where that's at.
Thank you very much.
Great, go ahead.
We will walk through the budgets in the order of the user pay utilities. So operating budget for the user pay utilities, then the universal services operating budget, and then we'll touch on the capital and only, again, the council priorities in that area. So user pay utilities are sewer, solid waste, and water. So generally just run through, and I think we touched on some of this at our last meeting to talk about what was in the budget. But our revenues are generally the user fee revenue and other fees that we charge. Major expenses and cost drivers are obviously salaries and wages, special contracts with solid waste, regional district charges for water and sewer, and solid waste tipping fees. General maintenance contracts, equipment and vehicle, and asset management, which we will touch on a little bit.
Excuse me, I've got a speaker. Councillor Richter?
Yes, I just want to confirm the salary and wage component. Does that include the benefits as well?
Yes.
And what percentage of the total budget? And I'll ask this question now so I don't have to keep coming back to it, but regardless of whether we're looking at universal services or utilities, what percent is salary and wage costs?
I think it's in our later slide, if we can, and if it doesn't answer your question, we can come back with a more clarification.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
Councillor Van Popta?
Yeah, just along the same line, I'm just looking at a line item of $5.8 million on salaries and wages just on water alone. Can you, approximately how many staff is that?
We could probably return to that when maybe later on in the presentation when we specifically get to some of those items. Would that be all right?
Yep.
These are, I think originally we're starting off at a pretty high level and then drilling down. So I think I would maybe come back to that. That works. Okay, great. Thanks.
And on
go
that
ahead.
point, if there's something that we don't answer, we'll just take it back and we can bring back those, because sometimes we don't get into the minutia at this level of the presentation.
I just like that number. Whoa.
Okay. So on this slide, it gives you a little bit of a sense of what the revenues and expenses are in these, in each category. So revenue looks significantly higher this year from transfers from reserves, because this is the first year of our Phase 2 Jericho water structure payment to Metro Vancouver. So that is coming out of our reserve. And then generally, the next revenue source is sale of services. And on expenses, the largest expenditure in this area is the regional district charges of sewer and water. And it may look higher than in previous years as well, because also included in that is the debt payment or the payment for Jericho Phase 2.
I have a question about that. Councillor Richter?
Yeah, I just want to confirm that the regional district charges are the 2023 charges, which had a slight increase to it. But starting in 2024, there's going to be a substantive increase in those charges?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So how much further that way is the bar going to go for our 5-year plan?
Yeah, so when we bring back the 5-year plan, we will see the impact of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would also like to add to that Metro Chair Harvey has convened a financial plan task force specific to trying to reduce some of those numbers that are projected by Metro Vancouver currently. And I sit on that task force, and I'll certainly report back to council on his progress. He has made it very clear that the percentage increases that Metro Vancouver is projecting are not acceptable to him, and there's much work to be done, so those numbers will likely come down. Go ahead. Oh, one more speaker. Councillor Ferguson?
Well, you beat me to it, Mr. Mayor. I did want to say that is true, and I think you might want to point out, I think there's going to be a task force's budget as well at Metro Vancouver level as well. You might want to flag that, Sandra, the fact that we'll be looking, I guess, down the end, towards the end of our budget deliberation, the Metro charges, sewer, water, regional, I guess, recycling, or what they call that. So that's just in the end, so you flagged it so we don't miss it. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. So each year we just talk briefly about some of our issues and challenges. They're quite consistent between Universal and this budget. So inflation, I think we've talked about that numerous times. Again, we were just talking about some of our regional charges and how they're increasing over time. We have salary and wage contract settlements with an expired contract. In each budget, and I'm not sure how much we touched on this in our last presentation, but we have operating impact of completed projects. So some of these are township capital completed projects, and some of them are contributed projects. And then we have infrastructure costs, which is continuing to support the infrastructure that we currently have.
I have a question. Councillor Richter?
Yes, salary and wage contract settlements. Is there any progress of any substantive nature being made on that?
Mr. Backen, I'll have you answer that.
It's a good question. I would say progress is being made, but it's a difficult year because of the inflationary factors that we're facing and the number of years we're trying to cover. So progress has been slow, but it is both parties are working to the best of their abilities, trying to advance matters. But I would say that there's still more work to do. It's a particularly challenging year given all the economic environment and the things that are happening around us with COVID and the other matters that are coming to an end.
And do we have any kind of a ballpark estimate of what kind of salary increases we're going to be levied?
We can only go by what other communities have done, and that's not always the best barometer. But I know for 2021 and 2022, the average settlements were around 2.5% in that range, primarily 2, I think is what it amounted to. And then in 2023, it's very much open for discussion. We've seen things on the island that might suggest, 3 or 4%. We've seen provincial government settlements at 5%. So maybe even beyond that. So it's something that we expect to see there to be an adjustment in 2023, but there's certainly more work to do before we can actually identify a number.
Okay, but they've been without a contract since 2020, so I'm assuming that the new contract is going to have to be backdated to 2021 or 2020, whenever it expired.
Yeah.
Are we going to be hit with salary cost increases for those years that are at the 2023 level, or are they going to be costs that are at a more reasonable level? Because as I recall, one of the unions anyway declined to extend their contract.
Right. So what I would say is this, that when we look at other communities, we know what their settlements were for 2021 and 2022. 23 is still a work in progress. we have looked at those and we've reserved in our numbers sufficient funds, I think, to deal with those traditional increases. If it goes beyond those, then it poses an issue that would have to be dealt with. But right now, as we're still in the discussion stage and there's much more work to do, I think we're comfortable at maintaining the envelopes that we've created.
Okay, and now will we be able to get a contract that extends for 3 years into the future plus the 2 years backdated? Or are we going to have to settle this year and go right away into negotiating again next year?
The term is a point of bargaining. I think we would say that it would be at least be a 3-year term covering 2023, but it could be a 4-year term covering 24. That's something that the parties have to look at from the context of what the implications are and the benefits and costs are to both parties.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Van Popte?
Is this something that we can expect to have wrapped up this year? It seems that it has been happening for a while. So is it? Traditionally, how long does negotiations take?
Mr. Braga?
No, I think there's a probability it'll be wrapped up this year. I think both sides are willing to try to move it forward to try to achieve that. There's much work to do, not only in the monetary side, but in the non-monetary side. Language is always critical in these things, and over the years, each side looks at the language and looks for improvements, and that's been an ongoing point of discussion. In terms of how long does it usually take, I think we actually actively started February or March of last year, so we're been going for almost a year, and sometimes they go quickly, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes 18 months. It really just depends upon the complexity of the issues.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think we've kind of touched on this, which is what we presented in the previous presentation as well, which is the regional charges and what we're having to face in the future. This year's water rate increase wasn't that high, but the future years look quite significant. And sewage and drainage as well. So just touch a bit on infrastructure costs provided for in the budget. So typically in each area, water, sewer, and solid waste, and we'll see this in universal as well, is we generally have a contribution to capital, which is current year operating costs, which are generally used to fund current year projects. We have transfers to reserves, which are generally reserved for future projects. Debt servicing, which deals with paying for previous projects, and then ongoing immediate costs in asset maintenance.
Councillor Richter?
Yes, the transfers to reserves and surplus for all three of them, traditionally, how much is that, or what percent is that goes in there?
It varies between each utility and what we're doing in that year and what we're planning for. And also, and again, when we get to universal, it definitely varies. We'll see some numbers in here that we can gather that from.
Is there a significant change to past practice in this budget in terms of transfers to reserves and surplus?
Not a significant change. We haven't. There's an opportunity for a change, but we haven't made any structural kind of changes.
Okay.
Really.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll walk through the budget changes as proposed currently for the 2023 budget by water, sewer, and solid waste. So we have salaries and wages, which is our general contract provisions, steps, and increments. There's service contract changes, which this year we've had significant changes in traffic control due to legal and requirements. So a lot of that service contract is created by that. The regional costs are the water purchases and the liquid waste. And then the line below that is our waste and organics collection and disposal, which is a outside contract. And then we have the operating impact of the OBIs, as we call them, for completed projects. These may change depending on where we get to with capital this year, so some of those could move in and out, but that's sort of our placeholder at the moment. Jericho prepayment phase 2. So we've been bringing the amount required for the prepayment for phase 2 in each year, and this is the last year to build up the payment. Administrative overhead where we share costs across the different divisions. Has a change. Supplies and other. So this one's gone down, and so has the utilities. And this is because mostly, I mean, it has a number of factors, but mostly those decreases have been related in water to bringing off the Fort Langley well number 2. So we've had some savings. And then we have a rate stabilization transfer. So this is each year we look to move money in or out of reserve to stabilize rates or knowing what we need in the future. So in this case, we have stabilized the rate through use of a transfer from reserve, and partly because if you'll see up in the regional water costs, there's been a significant increase this year. Part of it's due to the just regular consumption and rate increase, and the other piece is due to bringing on the Fort Langley purchases from Metro as opposed to our own water. So we've tried to stabilize that for this year and sort of bleed it into the water rate over a couple of years.
Yeah, I have a question about that. But also too, it's in regards to that Brookswood and Murrayville have been on Metro Vancouver water for some time. And this is also included in that 4.2, is that correct?
No, that number we've been funding through a one-time.
Okay.
Because we expected that we would come off of that. So we've still left that in a one-time for this year. We'll see it
So
later in the
that's contributing to
presentation.
the 2.8 one-time rate stabilization?
No,
That's a one-time. So where is that itemized here?
That'll be, it's not in here. That would be used in prior year surplus if
Right,
it's available.
okay, so
So
you'll
it'll
come
be
to
in our
that-
last, I think it's the
That
last
later.
page.
So I think that'd be good, important to highlight for council's information. It'd be great. Okay, thank you.
And then we have some revenue increases from general growth and fees over the last year that we kind of true up our budget.
Oh, I had one more question
Oh,
before. Sorry, I wanted to highlight while you were still there. What happens to the Jericho payment when Jericho is paid off?
We can either bring that money back down or use it for other projects in the water.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Van Popta, go ahead.
Sorry, just on that same topic, how long is Jericho budgeted
Maybe
for?
maybe give a brief rundown for new councillors on what Jericho is and how it was paid for.
So we had an agreement, we have Jericho Phase 1 that works,
Everybody know what Jericho is? So Jericho is the reservoir. Maybe start there. The Jericho is the reservoir project in North Langley, right?
right, which we're sharing costs, and it's been done in 2 phases, and I'm not sure if there's a third phase or not. Well,
There may be a third phase
Yeah.
depending on growth. Yeah.
So we're paying off the first phase, but the second phase was not yet started, and we entered a deal with Metro Vancouver that we would pay it we'd pay it up front so that we could fix the cost essentially for us, and they would deal with any cost increases above that. So over the last 5 years, we've been bringing in $818,000 a year into the base budget in order to get to the 4.091 million that we need to pay
Per year for
for 4 years.
for 4 years. So total of about 16, 17 million, just a round number. Is that roughly what the total payment will be when it starts?
I didn't write it down.
So that's just
Yeah,
to
anyways.
clarify, that was done such that these payments could be made with no significant increases on a year-over-year basis to the water utility users. Is that correct?
Correct. Otherwise, we've been hit this year in our first year of payment with a $4 million increase. So
Increase,
we
yeah.
built up to it over time, which has helped put money into the reserve. That money, excess money ended up going into the reserve each year. So there's a bigger reserve in that fund. So we will make the first payment this year and the last payment in 2026, I believe. 2026. And then after that, there will be excess funds, depending on what happens if there's a Jericho Phase 3 or not. We may
Councilor Van
enter
Popte,
into a
do
similar thing.
you have anything else? Is that good? Good. Councilor Richter.
Meow, I was just wondering, with the prepayment idea, the whole Jericho was expanded. It's now going to be handling effluent from across on the other side of the river. Isn't that correct?
No, Jericho's the water project. You're referring to the North Langley wastewater
Okay,
treatment
so
facility,
that's the waste
entirely
one. Okay,
separate.
I'll hold
yeah.
that till I get to the waste.
Okay.
Also, the rate stabilization adjustment, the prior year's surplus, why would we rate stabilize? I mean, it's a user fee. It's, if you're using water, you should pay for it.
So, you know what, it creates a significant increase, and we've been doing this, I think, historically, we've been trying to smooth out some of these increases to our users when we have the funds available in the reserves to do that.
Okay.
So that, I mean, that is council's prerogative.
Yeah, but that's not a discussion I don't recall council having had in recent years.
Mr. Backen, do you want to?
It's the challenge is the utilization of the surplus and the reserve itself. So when water, or any utility for that matter, has surplus funds in it, they can either be used for capital or for to be returned to the users because they were collected from the users. So rate stabilization is really returning, I guess, payments to the users that turned out not to be necessary or were, I guess, from excess usage that generated more fees from the commodity itself being sold. Traditionally, then councils dealt with those at the budget process and either agreed or disagreed with the rounding of those. So it's really up to each council to make the decision as to whether or not they want to use the surplus for the purpose of either capital or for just a reserve for the future use, or to return it to the users by way of using these rounding. And in this case, it's the rate stabilization adjustment.
Okay, can we flag that to come back to, because the cost of water is going up, and that's just a fact of life, and I think that cost needs to get passed on to the consumer.
Yeah, so I think that's great to flag this. I think this is just a draft line item. You could have picked 5 million, you could have picked 1 million. So I appreciate you showing this to us in a substantial number, and that can certainly be modified by council. But I think this is a concept that makes sense. If we have been working our way up to the Jericho payment in the base budget, that money's been flowing into reserve. That money in reserve now is not going towards the original purpose that it was necessarily being brought to the utility for. So what round numbers, I believe the water utility reserve is hitting $30 million. Is that correct?
The total balance?
Total
I think
balance?
it's between 25 and 30.
Whatever the accrued balance is, but I believe it was showing a really healthy cash balance. So this, I think, in theory, could make sense, but of course the number could be tweaked and changed. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Knudst?
Yeah, a question about the same line. So if we've transferred into the reserve and now we're using it, like how often what's the number that we normally put into the reserve? And is this now going to be something that we're going to see every year to keep our water prices down or water costs down?
Well, it's not, it is a finite balance always, so you couldn't use it forever.
Right.
So typically what we've done on this line for the rate stabilization is to help smooth out some of the impacts of large increases in any of the utilities. So we can move that number around and look at those rates and the impact on.
So next year, if we're looking at the same sort of, we won't have that buffer of, say, $2.8 million to sort of make this number look better. Would that be
Could or could not, depending on, we'd have to look at what's available in the reserve.
Okay.
And that would be a decision to be made.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Ruff, also, would I be correct in summarizing that in next year's budget, the Jericho line item for almost 900,000 or over 900,000 will go away? So that would also potentially help with future rate increases if this council wants to deliver the highest quality water possible to its residents.
Correct.
Thank you. Carry on.
Okay.
Oh, Councillor Richter, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more follow-up question. The regional costs, the 4.2, how much of that regional cost is being driven by taking well 2 off and having 100% of the water serving Fort Langley?
Which number are you referring to, Councillor
The
Richter?
regional costs for water purchases and liquid waste.
Oh, the top
4286.
Liquid waste, you're talking about the 4286 within water, not liquid waste.
Yeah.
Right,
Water
yeah.
purchases.
Could you follow up with that? I would think it would be good to get a
2.8
specific.
million.
2.8 is for the Fort Langley portion. Yeah.
Okay, so, and that's not going to go away because the well's offline now. All right, thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Then we have some anticipated growth. So we anticipate water and sewer to grow by 2% and solid waste by 1.76. To get down to our utility user rates requested increase of 6.23% for water, 2.78% for sewer, and 5.87% for solid waste. We then had some discretionary requests that were presented by staff. So water was looking for another water operator due to growth in the system, and wastewater was looking also for another collection system operator. And we were also looking at doing a transfer to reserve in solid waste. Our carts are aging, and we seem to run into an issue with having enough funds to deal with them each year. So we thought starting a transfer to reserve would be optimal, but those again are discretionary. That would bring us down to 6.57% increase in water, 3.22 in sewer, and 8.15 in solid waste.
Councillor Ferguson?
Okay, I just, I think you quickly went over that user pay utility revenue from growth.
Yeah.
Okay, were you saying that that was a challenge or something in the, I guess, in the red and the negative? So you're saying, was there specific reasons or multi-reasons for that?
So those revenue increases are actually showing an increase in revenue. So red in this case is good, in brackets is good. And that was just truing up because these are both metered and flat rate charges. It's a true up from what we received last year. So there could have been more or less growth last year than we predicted.
Okay, so well, I guess as we look at the increases, we'll see how that levels out. Thank you.
Councillor Van Popda?
Just a quick question. Was that request for a water operator made before or after well 2 was turned off?
Likely before, because we started the budget process before.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Richter?
Yeah, on that vein, also I wanted to ask a similar question. If we're purchasing more Metro water, do we need more jobs or positions?
Maybe Mr. Back.
It's the short answer is it depends. We have staff now that say are experts in water hydrology, but we may need to have experts in water flow. Sometimes they can be transitioned, sometimes it's a different area of expertise. What's moving is the same level of volume through the pipes, just a different source. So the transmission will remain the same, but the source may have implications. So at this point, I don't know if we have a definitive answer. We can come back and look at that, but I would say that it's unlikely that the switch is going to cause any significant or massive savings in terms of the overall operation, but it may cause some changes in terms of how the business is being done.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So then we'll talk about one time. So these are expenditures that we generally pay for through prior year surplus funding, and they're expenditures that should only occur in 1 year. We expect that we don't want to increase the base budget and then bring it back out in the following year. So here we have the Murrayville water purchase from Metro Vancouver, so that's 1.6 million. That has been in for a couple years. We expected it to have come out before this. We have well decommissioning, and this is different than the Fort Langley well number 2. This is Fort Langley well number 1, which is an artesian well, and Willoughby well number 1. My understanding is that these are currently not in service, but they don't meet health requirements, but they need to be permanently closed. Hazardous material management program in water and sewer. So there's some updated hazardous material management requirements that require all buildings to have asbestos and lead abatement before any studies done, before any renovations can be done. So we need to update some of those. And then we put in a small contingency in case we're not correct in our projections on salary and wage changes
I have
for
a
previous years.
question about this particular slide. So prior year surplus, this is prior year surplus for the entire corporation? No, this is only specific to the
Yes.
utilities. This is prior year services within all 3 utilities or specific utilities?
Each utility is separate because they're billed separately. So each utility is treated as a separate entity.
Okay, so I might want a little bit more information on some of that too. And using the prior year surplus, because essentially the prior year surplus within the utility would go into the reserve if it was not otherwise expended. Is that correct?
Yeah,
'Cause where else
it's
would-
essentially a reserve.
Because it has to stay within the
Yeah.
utility. So this is essentially a transfer to reserve and then using the reserve to fund these items. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. Carry on.
Okay. So we'll move along to our universal services, which is our operating budget for all the other areas, and general taxation.
Councillor Richter, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wonder, back on page 9, you had said that there was 30 million in the reserve for water. What about sewer and solid waste?
I think we
recall
probably have a
s-
future slide that has them in.
Yeah,
I'm not-
recall sewers around 18, and there was no reserve in solid waste, something like that.
Solid waste generally has no reserve.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Go ahead.
okay, so some of the context that we had with the budget was that we have council direction to target 4% increase for 2023. As we talked about before, we have inflation and supply chain issues still ongoing with the latest inflation number I could find, 7.2% in November, hoping that that's leveling out. We do get direct costs, drivers that we can't really control, like Metro Vancouver levies, RCMP contracts, and construction costs, which tend to trend above CPI. We also still have some ongoing uncertainty with respect to COVID and the full recovery of revenues and the resolution of staffing shortages. So while we're reopening more fully, we don't anticipate to have a full recovery of revenue until 2024. So next up, we need to get council review and input, and then we will have to complete our 5-year plan once we've had more input. So this is a bit of the timeline. I've left a lot of the dates blank. We have some gaps between today and some things we need to accomplish before May 15th, which is our final property tax user fee charges bylaw needs to be complete by then so that we can meet our regulatory requirements. We will need to have further council discussion, budget revisions, complete the remaining 5 years, and have public consultation. So then we'll walk through some of the items that have been referred to the budget process through the last year of council. There was a equity, diversion, and inclusion framework that that council referred considerations of funding and additional staff resource to support this to the budget. This is in our list of items deferred. I've highlighted it for this presentation. It is not in our base budget at this point, but it is on our list of deferred for council's consideration. The animal control and sheltering services agreement and budget, council referred an increase of $187,000 to the inclusion in the budget. We have included it in the operating budget. We'll see it when we get there.
I have a question about that, if that's all right, but you're done with this slide, but I have a question.
Sure.
I know you're trying to, I appreciate trying to get through this. Is that required or requested?
I would have to check.
Okay, if you could check into that,
Yeah.
that'd be great. Oh, right, sorry, Councillor
We
Ferguson,
also-
go ahead.
We also have agreement with, I think, City of Langley. Anybody else, or just City of Langley, if I may, for animal control?
Bracken?
So the animal control contract we have is with LAPS. They have a separate contract with the city that's for them to determine. We don't have a contract with the city per se. And I believe this is from a report that was from last fall, no, maybe last summer, where they were actually providing some direction in terms of what their costs were looking at. So I think we can recirculate that report and determine what the nature of the request is.
Well, is there any, I mean, I just thinking out loud, say, we need a truck to pick up some animals or something, a barking dog or something. And, you know, we buy the truck and then we service another community. But we've already bought the truck and they've got a but they haven't done the line entry to what percentage that would be on a contract they have. And those are kind of things that, you know, we're always watching for. So I don't know, maybe I can't expect you to have an instant answer for that, but maybe you can flag that and see how the two. I actually thought, you know, we have this facility, we've done an awful lot of improvements. I just wondered, you know, another community coming in and just paying a fee, and you just wanted, that's just kind of thinking out loud, that's all.
So close. So what we can say is that when LAPS actually does their rates or their I guess negotiations, they look at it as being a revenue enhancement for them, which would be a expense reduction for ourselves. meaning that they should be taking into account such things as use of vehicles or the building or wherever that may actually be. It's looked at as being something that they can, I guess, on a per hour usage of service, generate excess revenue over their cost to keep our costs down. That's the understanding. These cost drivers, though, are a bit different. I believe these are the same cost drivers we're facing, which is going to be inflationary charges for commodities, for goods and services, and for labor.
That's what I was hoping for. I mean, I was just flagged that. Thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead.
One other item referred to council was 44 additional suppression firefighters for 2023 through 2026. This is a total we've added this into our budget. So it's slightly higher in the first year as the training officers are hired, and it'll end up at 44 in the end, even though it may look like it's higher. We've started those at an October 1st, 2023 date in our budget because we wouldn't have them in place before that time. That just means we will annualize them in the next year's budget as well as adding new ones.
I have a question, but I also have one before I get to that. The 2 training officers, that was not specifically identified or referred by council. So where did that request come from? And is that actually required at this point for 11, or is that anticipating the additional hires in future years?
I believe that came from the fire department itself.
Okay, so maybe we could flag that and understand more about the need to hire 2 people to train 11 people. Councillor Richter. Oh, sorry, I'm going to
4
change.
captains. Why do we need 4 captains for 7 firefighters? I don't get that.
I don't think I can address that question,
We'll flag
but we
that,
can
Councillor
have
Richter.
that, yeah.
We'll flag that for more information. Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that, Councillor Bailey. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the same thing because since you're bringing on 11 in the first year, that's a decision that'll be made by the chief at that time if there are any officers required. Very easily, they could bleed 11 firefighters in with no additional captains.
Yeah, so I think we'll flag that, Councillor Bailey. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Carry on.
Then we had a number of 2023 budget directives. So the first one we've sort of talked about, the 4%, we are working towards that. We have organized some discretionary items for council to review. We've also looked at some optional items that may provide reductions. Obviously, that's open for additional input from council. And there was a comment about ceasing the practice of oversubscribing to DCCs. We'll be dealing with that as we work through the capital budget and where the funding is coming from for the capital.
Yeah, so I had a question about this, and I don't think I missed it, but I looked at the future slides. On the council motion here, I pulled it from the December 5th council meeting. There were 4 other directives related to the budget that you didn't list here. Just want to make sure you haven't forgotten about those. Everything from the reserve to the new policy to the mill rate potentially being adjusted. And I want to emphasize potentially because I don't want to get the same delusion correspondence about something that's only potential. And BC assessment averaging and other items that were mentioned in that, you're not listing them here. I just wanted to confirm why you're not listing them here.
I was dealing with them more as reports and not with necessarily a direct impact on the current year's operating budget.
So the one that I think that may not be applicable to potentially BCSF and averaging or the mill rate adjustment, which potentially could be done in this budget. So I wanted to flag those. If you can potentially see those as possible for this budget, separate from these. They're not listed here, so I just wanted to confirm that decision hasn't been made by you or anyone else, that those are still in consideration for this budget, even if they're not listed here.
Yes, they'll come back as reports.
Great. Councillor Kunst?
Yeah, could you give me an example of the current practice of oversubscribing the DCCs, just so I have a clear understanding of what that actually means?
So we obviously have a DCC balance that we've received over the course of years, and then we have projects that are on the DCC approved DCC list. We approve budget for DCC related projects during a year, but those projects, the total of those may be greater than the balance we're currently holding. What it does is allow for those projects to go forward if receipts are received during the year. I think that's the essence of what it is.
And so seizing that current practice, we would just, how do we change how we do that?
we could look at, there's a number of ways we could probably do it. We could look at our current balance and make sure that we're not oversubscribing.
Okay.
Or set a priority list for council that, if we get more receipts, perhaps these are the projects that go forward.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So perhaps two quick things
Yeah,
on those
Mr. Bracken,
topics.
you can add to that. I was going to add to it as well, but go ahead.
Going back to the BC assessment or the averaging, I'm not sure. There was a communication that was received recently from the province that they acknowledged the fact that we're looking at, was it mill rates or assessment? There was something that came.
Assessment averaging.
So that's been acknowledged. Number two, then, in terms of the DCC, what happened many years ago in terms of times when there was low DCCs, it became apparent that there was a delay, say, from 21 to 22 in terms of the funds coming in and then expending them. The projects were delayed. So what transpired was it was decided that many years ago that one could actually look at the projects and say we have $10 million worth of projects this year. The DCC funds as they come in will be applied to those projects. So if you will, you were advancing them by a year because you were waiting for the money to come in. And if they came in, you would build them. If you didn't come in, you would not. The problem with that over the years has been, though, that that's created a list of DCC projects that are somewhat underway, but not really underway because they're still waiting for funding and then new priorities come up. So it is, I think, a prudent thing every once in a while to reset the list to see what we're going to do. And I think this is a reset mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's a good label for it. Also, I think that the practice of doing it, Ms. Ruff, I think you and I have discussed this briefly, and for council's information, what may happen and could happen theoretically is if you have, say, 10 DCC projects approved, you only have enough money for 8, you do the 8, and then the next year you might add 8 more, but only have money. We had 10 more, but then only have money for 8. You have 4 projects now that council wanted to see done that aren't proceeding, because you have other projects always superseding previous projects. So what ended up happening, correct me if I'm wrong, but there would be staff making the decision of which projects to proceed with, even though council in previous years had decided it wanted to build this intersection or that intersection. It wasn't proceeding based upon alternative decision-making.
Yeah, it's hard to determine which one's the priority, I guess, at that point.
So this, in some cases, I think I've noticed that council is approving intersections within the DCC program. They're not proceeding because the program is oversubscribed. Is that correct? One way to
obviously
interpret
don't make
it.
those decisions.
Yeah, make those decisions,
but-
yeah. I think I made my point. Councillor Ferguson, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought for a second my request to speak button didn't work anymore. Well, at least I got somebody to laugh during all this serious stuff. I also wanted to bring something up that as you look at the 2023 budget directives, and this came up as an idea between the last time we met and now today. So not something I was thinking about 2 months ago. This came up, and I was thinking, I've talked to administration and others about it. And looking at what other communities do in Richmond, Delta, Surrey, and Vancouver, the list goes on in the region, and perhaps even Abbotsford, is the fact that perhaps there might be an opportunity for council to explore a special levy, and that would be a tax levy of some sort, or in addition to a tax bill, special levy. We've done that before. Other communities has done it before, and that would be specific to things like safety, police, fire. And as we see in the news and we see all across the country, the public safety is a major thing, as some of my colleagues, Councillor Martin and Councillor Tim Bailey, forgot your last name, and my apologies. And the thing is, that might be an opportunity to explore and see what's needed. We need fire halls, we need fire people, we need police, we need an opportunity in the future for a new police station. These are all things to explore for the future, and I don't expect these items to be solved overnight or in a couple of years on council. But I think that's something that we should explore, because those are used to call those things cost drivers, or items of challenge and items of financial concern for the future. So that's just an item I want to throw out, a special levy. And Mr. Mayor, I just want to throw that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Van Popta?
Just to understand a little bit better the history, when we overprescribed, where was that money coming from to pay for them?
We never started a project if the funds weren't available.
Okay, so I was thinking if it was oversubscribed, we were spending. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Councillor Richter?
Yeah, a couple of points. The first one is on DCCs. I know Metro recently started with sewer DCCs, and now they're moving to put water DCCs in place. Has the potential impact of Metro having full DCC charges been taken into account on that impact on our ability to charge DCCs?
Mr. Bracken, do you think that it would really factor into our thinking because the DCC program is project-based?
Yeah, they would be treated independently, so our list would stand on its own, and Metro would add effectively its own list to it, and then the application of it to development would be, I guess, twofold, one from us and one from Metro Vancouver. We'd be the stewards of it, but would be looking at the combined total. We wouldn't be reducing ours because of Metro's and vice versa.
Okay. And the second thing is relative to the universal budget, well, actually the whole budget, is it possible to get the total number of new jobs that are going to be added under this budget, the total dollar value, and the average salary and benefits? I'd also like to know what % of new jobs will be union versus what % will be exempt. And can I also get, or could council also get, the same thing, a list of the number of old jobs that are going to be deleted, the % union versus % exempt, and the total dollar value and the average salary and benefits per deleted position.
Do you have that, Ms. Ruff? We good?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead,
so, I think
proceed.
so.
Yep.
Okay. So again, this is very similar to our previous presentation slides around what our revenues are. Obviously, property tax, we get some extra revenue from new growth, and there can be growth in user fees and charges. In this case, we see an increase in recreation, but recreation fees, we're still not at where we were pre-COVID. Salaries and wages, obviously we have the QP and the fire union as well as exempt staff in this budget. Special contracts, RCMP contract, Fraser Valley Regional Library contract, e-com and recycling. And then we have some relationships here with Regional District and TransLink in transportation and stormwater. Then maintenance contracts, we see some significant increases this year, some of them around things like mowing. There's fuel increases that we're being hit with. Materials and supplies, again, just general inflation. Equipment and vehicles similar, and supply chain issues. And then asset management, similar to what we discussed previous. So when we look at the revenue sources in this case, special levies and grants in lieu looks to be the largest. And that's a little bit because we treat the library levy separately. So we take the costs out and receive it as a levy, as a separate line on the bills, similar to what we're sort of looking at for other levies. So that's a significant portion of that money. Then next largest would be transfers from reserves. And in here, there's actually a placeholder number of $5 million as well, so that inflates that a little bit. And then in sales of services, we have mostly rec is where we'd see that, but also airport fuel sales, et cetera, in there.
Councillor Richter?
Yeah, I just, on talking about the library, council got items distributed, a recent email from somebody asking if there would be the new Willoughby Library in this budget. Is there a new Willoughby Library in this budget, or has it been removed?
Your Worship, the current thinking is that the new library would be in the new Willoughby Recreation Center that's been listed as one of the council priorities. So it would be standing independent. Now, the scope and scale of that has not yet been defined because we haven't finished the scope and scale of the Willoughby Recreation Center, but it's I guess, indirectly included as part of that facility.
Would I be correct, Mr. Bracken, in saying that it's still a ways away where the current library is being contemplated or was contemplated by the previous council? It was neither added nor removed from this particular budget because the timing doesn't require it. Is that fair?
That's correct. The potential one that we're referencing was going to be a leasehold, and we're moving away from that leasehold potentially if we can actually incorporate it in the new recreation center itself. Why I'm pausing on that is merely because we haven't had a discussion of the elements of what the recreation center should include and what the cost of that would be and the scope of that and the implications of it. So that's something that we're just having to be cautious of and
I
recognize.
think
as
that
we
would
have
be something for this council to consider when that scope has potentially been identified. Is that correct? Okay, great, thank you. Yeah.
And for expenses, as a service provider, obviously salaries and wages ends up being the largest expense. And then we have to look at special contracts as our next largest category, which would include the RCMP and the Fraser Valley Regional Library costs.
Yeah, Sandra, just to looking at that, salaries and wages are about $100 million total. What would our total operating budget be? Because that would answer the earlier question in terms of what percentage that represented.
155, 160.
You could certainly follow up with a specific slide showing that, Ms. Ruff, I believe.
Yeah.
That would be, I think, appropriate. I had a question about this, not seeing others. Transfers to reserves, can you outline how a transfer to reserve would be considered an expense?
So if we're using funds from property tax and we're putting it into a reserve for future years, it is an expense.
Right. So when you're categorizing it as an expense, but the money's not necessarily being expended.
Correct.
Yeah.
But we are using money to put away for future.
And then I also wanted to highlight debt principal and interest. Looks like a very small bar compared to many of the others. What portion of that, I think it would be important for us to know, is interest versus actually paying for capital projects? I think I would like to see that broken out. Maybe, and I could certainly do the math myself with other slides that have been presented in the past. I think it'd be helpful to see that when you see a debt principal and interest item, a lot of people may perceive that as simply being a payment. But in fact, that is an annual contribution to capital as well as an interest payment. Would that be fair to characterize it that way?
It's a payment for capital costs undertaken in the past as well as interest.
But a portion of that will be a principal payment, which essentially is a contribution to paying for a project of the past. But that is a contribution to capital. That is building an asset. Is that correct? That would be fair to characterize it that way. So I think I would be interested to see debt principal and debt interest broken out on separate lines, or at least provided to us separately, so council could see an interest cost versus what I would like to characterize as a contribution to building the community.
Yeah.
Councillor Kunst?
Besides the RCMP, what other special contracts do we have?
So the majority, the largest other one would be the Fraser Valley Regional Library.
Okay. So, so special contracts, that's in addition to, I guess I would have thought that would have been in with salaries and wages, but it's not.
It's salaries and wages are only internal salaries and wages.
So that would be firefighters and that, yeah, okay,
Correct.
thank you.
That's a good question. I appreciate that being raised. So would the special contract include the civilian RCMP staff, or would that be in salaries and wages?
They would be in salaries and wages.
So these are just simply, would they be fair to characterize them as services
provides-
provided by the RCMP, but not for the civilian support that we provide to the RCMP? So there'd be some individual items to consider there too.
Okay.
Councillor Ferguson?
Yeah, thank you. You might have already mentioned this, but I did want to know about a little bit quick question on history of the RCMP. I think our last term, they actually went unionized, and the contract that was negotiated was, we budget for the thing was higher than the budget that we went through. Is that not the case, if I may, historically?
There is a retro piece that they will be paid, which we believe is fully accrued in our previous budgets. So now we're at a new rate. The retro has not been completely settled, but we're assuming that we have enough.
So the settled by us or settled by the,
RCMP,
and that's federally their portion or our portion?
Our portion.
That's the
Obviously,
same question.
what we believe will be our portion.
It ended up, if I may, historically being more money, which means more taxpayer money included at the time.
Correct.
Yeah. So that kind of chipped away at our budget. And that's going back 2 years or something.
I can't remember, actually, 2 or 3.
Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. These things kind of catch us in reverse. Thank you.
We're thinking we're caught up on that one, right? So
Councillor Van Popte?
Just a quick question. What percentage of the special contracts is Vancouver, or is the regional library contracts? Ballpark.
You could always follow up with that too, Ms. Ruff, if you don't have it immediately
I think it's
available.
probably, I think we show it later on, but we
Oh.
can do it as a
You could also
percentage.
break out special contracts maybe into some categories, because just to refresh my memory, but also for members of council to see what's in there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Again, we'll just touch briefly on our issues and challenges, obviously inflation, the regional costs. Didn't we do this? Salary and wages, sorry. Infrastructure costs and asset management. And then again, the COVID impact that we're still experiencing. So RCMP, we'll talk about some of the regional costs. The two big ones, RCMP and FVRL. So further to our discussion, our increase this year is $2 million in RCMP. Majority of that will be in salaries, but we also will have indirect costs, their pension, et cetera, and some E-Division administration overhead. So that is their overhead, not our overhead. The only thing we include, again, in this line is their costs to us. So just a bit of a recap, which we show each year, is how that money is being spent. So it's $202,571 per member annually, and the majority of that money being salaries. So we also talk about authorized strength. So we budget for authorized strength of 158.65. Our actual average, now this is at September, we have not received our December billing, which would show us our annual average update, is 130.83. Looks like we're starting to move in the right direction again with filling those after the COVID issues they had with supplying officers during COVID.
Just wanted to highlight, just to confirm, again, I think one of my favorite topics. So the blue chart is, again, the city of Langley. They have not added an RCMP officer in 4 budgets. That seems to be accurate.
Correct.
Well, we seem to have added 14, net 14. Do I also see that their actual deployment has gone down from 47 to 41? Would that be accurate numbers?
Correct.
Correct. So if their actual deployment has gone down from 47 to 41, how are they policing their streets? Maybe that's more rhetorical than something that you're going to be able to answer. But I think these numbers are something important for this council to keep top of mind here as we continue to consider the future structure of policing in the 2 Langleys, how this is sustainable when our neighbor isn't adding capacity and in fact their actual deployment is going down, which would seem to suggest logically that potentially some of the deployment intended for the township would be responding to service in the city, calls for service in the city. How is that reconciled financially, Ms. Rowe?
So we have a cost-sharing agreement with them. So at the end of the year, we split the costs. So they do end up picking up a different amount than they may necessarily show in their numbers.
So if we're having a challenge filling vacancies based upon some of the provincial federal issues, and they're not adding officers, their deployment's going down. Even if we're attempting to add capacity for township residents, that's potentially being diverted to another municipality, even if we're being paid back for it. The resources that we're intending for our community are in fact going to another community. Is that what's happening? But they wouldn't
comment.
they wouldn't be paying us though if our members were not in the city. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think we share a detachment, so I think that is.
We share a detachment for now. Yeah, thank you. Councillor Richter?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the cost sharing at the end of the year, has it been going up or down?
The adjustment?
Like, could we rather than put you on the spot here with it, maybe we could get that flagged and get that information back. I'd like to see if they're paying us back more over the last 4 years, or if they're paying us back less.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And also, I have a question about why are our numbers down? I mean, we're funding 158, but we've only got 130. That's leaving us with quite a surplus, I would guess.
So obviously, there's been supply issues during COVID, and we can't control that. They're going down, and we're going down. Like the ratio is pretty much the same usually. But yeah, we do end up with a surplus.
Okay, and another question that I think we should come back to, Mr. Backen, is I know in the past we had talked about the ability of the township to pick up some RCMP officers from the Surrey move at the time to not have RCMP. If Surrey is going to retain its RCMP, how is that going to affect our ability to get our numbers up?
Yeah, Mr. Bracken, I've had a few conversations with Mayor Locke about it. Do you have any insight on what's happening there potentially?
There's a lot of uncertainty, unfortunately, because there's some suggestion that some of the, well, first of all, will it occur? And if it, or as they would say, when it occurs, what does it mean? Can people go back then from there to where they originated? And the short answer is likely not, because of pension contributions. That's going to create a bit of a boon, I suppose, then for private forces, because they're very easy to go to. What I mean by that is municipal forces. They can go to those, which means that the RCMP will have to look at their overall complement and try to increase the production of cadets. In our circumstance, what you're seeing when you have an authorized strength of, say, 160 is there's always going to be a certain slippage from illness, leaves, whatnot. The RCMP compensates for those. The challenge we've always had is, can we actually do a budget based on authorized versus average actual strength? And the short answer is we've always been told we have to do it based on the authorized strength, because there is a built-in surplus there that we would like to otherwise access. So all of those factors then create a lot of uncertainty in terms of trying to come up with an accurate number, or the appropriate number of members, and as well how those members could be procured or obtained. We still are a very desirable location, even with the housing costs. It's simply a matter of the available supply, and that's going to be something that we think is recovering, but will still take some time.
Thank you.
Councillor Van Popta?
When you report on the adjustment at the end, can you just make sure that it addresses if it's in comparable to the calls that are responding to each municipality? So is the adjustment, does it correlate, or is it just some standard, 60-40 split, or is it proportionate to the calls that went out?
Yeah, Ms. Ruff, I think the more details on the adjustment would be good. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, there is a formula, so it's to do with population and criminal stats, so
Okay.
we can bring
Yeah,
that back.
so presumably if they have more cases per officer occurring inside their boundary, they're going to be compensating the detachment for that additional cost. Is that generally what's occurring?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the more policing required for the city per unit of resident or per officer? You can always get back to me on that too, because,
Well,
generally, if their
there's-
demands are higher, they're compensating the township for some of its costs, right?
Yeah, again, it has to do with population as well as crime stats, so it's.
You say crime stats, you mean calls for service, would that, or
Well,
is it more detailed than that? No?
It's a BC criminal code. No, CCC, I can't remember what it's called.
But more demand for policing services
Yes.
will result in some feedback loop of funding coming back to the township for its members being deployed in the city. Is that the fair way to say it?
Correct.
Correct, yeah. Councillor Martins, thank you for weighing in on this.
Yes, thank you. So I would like a breakdown of what that actual calculation is. Just looking at criminal code stats is disregarding a lot of calls for service, and probably the majority of calls for service, because they're related to public disorder and nuisance calls and neighborhood complaints and that sort of thing that do not fall under criminal code. So I think that needs to be clearly included. So when you're asking calls for service, that is different than criminal code stats. The other thing is, I'm hoping they dig deeper than the call number metric alone, because you can have a call where there's one officer responding and dealing with it, or you can have a major call that requires dozens and dozens of police resources, and that's a very different financial impact, and also time required on calls. So I would really like to drill down and see how we are coming at this formula.
Keep, yeah.
So then as we were talking earlier, the Fraser Valley Regional Library, so our current, they had a general increase this year of 3.21%, and then we had some additional staffing that was added by them at the libraries. So our total increases from them on our contract is $215,000. So our revised annual cost is $4.9 million.
Now, I had a question about the FVRL. You said it was presented separately on the property tax statement.
Yes.
I went back and looked at mine from last year, and it wasn't there. So maybe I'll go look again for it.
Just called library levy.
Library levy. I'll look again for it, and then but I did look for it, and so it's not typically buried within universal services. It is
It
presented
is part of
separately.
universal
Okay, maybe I missed
services,
it. And then they make decision making on what staff is required, and so if we said we weren't interested in additional staffing, what would be the process with that? Is that something that's available even to us?
I believe we have feedback on that,
Yeah.
and it impacts hours and et cetera.
Et cetera. So there'd be some other way to address it, but they've determined that they needed an additional staffing resource in the Fort Langley Library. I think I
I think
read
it's Fort
somewhere
Langley because of the move, I think.
because of the move and then the expansion of that library or the new library location in Salshan.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that. So that general increase of 3.21, that is decision making that they're making that is being passed on to us. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Pratt?
Thank you. Mr. F, you might not have the information right now. Are we, in terms of the other member organizations in the FVRL, where's the township in terms of resources we pay in to the FVRL compared to Abbotsford or any of the other municipalities?
So we are 16.6% of their budget, and we are the largest member. Abbotsford follows us very, very closely, though, as the second largest.
So that 3.21%, was that across the board? It wasn't proportional?
That is across the board. They do things a little different in an election year, so there's no difference between the different members. We will have to make up a slight bit difference next year, I think around 16,000 they're suggesting, because there's a different proportion in a normal year.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ferguson?
Okay, a little bit of housekeeping now. Abbotsford has more people than us, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay, and they have a larger land base, even though we always talk about how large our land base, they have a larger land base than us as well. I was always under the impression that Abbotsford had a higher percentage with the Fraser Valley Regional Library than us, and also that the headquarters for the Fraser Valley Regional Library is in Abbotsford. I was always under that impression.
It is in Abbotsford. I think they are really close to paying the same amount as we do, but it depends on your services that you're offering. Size
I
of
know
your
it does
libraries,
depend on
right?
that. That's what I mean. That's why I wanted you to kind of flag that, because have they slowed down their growth or their addition of library or addition of staff and other things where we haven't? Where we have and they haven't? That would be those kind of housekeeping questions I'd ask. So we'll see how that goes. Thank you.
So, Your Worship, perhaps to weigh in just a little bit.
ahead.
The model is primarily based on hours, or based on usage, that is the number of, it's not quite this simple, but I use as an example, books that have been taken out. I know books are no longer the common thing, there's many other things. So it's the usages, I guess, that are the primary driver. The second factor then is the hours of operations or service. So if we were to be requesting our libraries be open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. versus they were saying 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., something different, that would greatly affect the funding in terms of what they were being billed or what their expenses would actually be. As I understand it, we can actually we can control the hours, but there's certain things that we can't control. There's some baselines we can add to, but we can't go under. And as such then that our costs are based on some of those baselines, and we can actually ask for service enhancements or reductions based on some of those baselines. Having said that, then the question becomes for ourselves then, how did we result at these? Well, they were primarily through historical input received from council through the Fraser Valley Regional Library rep to the board in terms of what our concerns are or what those issues would be. So they would have been reported back to council by the rep and then simply included in the budget processes.
Okay, so I have my next, other than how many people live in Abbotsford and how big Abbotsford is Delta still in the Fraser Valley Regional Library System?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay, so, and they must be close to be number 3 or something. And then there's a whole bunch of small little libraries. Okay, we'll look at that later on.
Councillor Pratt?
Thank you. Just to follow up to that, Mr. Backen or Mr. F, do you know if the members or the staff who work in the FER libraries, are they members of a union?
Yes. There's management staff and then there's unionized staff, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Then the same as we talked about in the utilities, it's just the infrastructure costs and asset management are significant portions of the budget.
Now the fun slide.
The fun stuff, the good stuff.
The fun slide now. Yeah.
So Sorry, that's pretty readable. So these are our changes currently in the year. We have salaries and wages, which is a total of 3.35%. Broke it up a little bit different this year to give a little more detail. We have just the regular number at the top, 3.23. We are reducing some salaries and wages in recreation. We have had some savings, and we just don't think that we'll be able to meet our target staffing level still. So this is probably a one-year advantage that will end up being made up as we're able to hire those people. The new museum has some additional salaries and wages required as it's a larger facility. And then we have some annualizations from 2022 where we hired people or budgeted to hire people partway through the year. And then we had 6 firefighters that we hired partway through the year last year. A total of 3.35% in that category. Then we have the fire that we're adding this year. Again, those are starting October 1st, and we'll revisit those numbers, but they currently are in at 0.35%. The RCMP contract increase is a 1.45%. The new North Langley CPO opened, and we have some TIs that we need to repay, and that's 0.07%. Recycling increase, the contract increased again, fuel, et cetera, is impacting that, and general inflation, 0.55%. Natural gas increases, 0.16. Here we had discussed previously the Langley Animal Protection Society, 0.12. And then there's a number of other service contract increases, and those are 0.21. Again, generally a lot of mowing, et cetera, that have fuel increases that they're requesting. Then there's a number of programs where again, we have service contract increases and just general increases, 1.71. We do have the return of recreation revenue to offset that. So this year we anticipate we will receive another 1.9 million. We still are 1.9 million short of where we were pre-COVID. We do have to remove the COVID Restart Grant. That was a one-time grant. So we're taking that revenue out that we had put in last year. Anytime we do a one-time item, we always have to deal with it in the future. We have operating impact of township capital and development in here, 681 in township capital and 499 in contributed capital. These again could change depending on where we end up with our capital budget, so those could move around a bit. Some of them will be for capital that was completed in the prior year, but some of them would have been anticipated in the current year. We have some debt repayment changes and provisions, so that's giving us back another 416. We have some changes in other miscellaneous other revenue expense where we're seeing increases, so 0.36, and then some rental revenue in parks, 250,000 or 0.16. We estimate our growth to be 2% in this year, so that would get us to currently at a 9.63%.
Question? Councillor Pratt?
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms. Ruff, if I could just draw our attention to the recycling contract increase line item. You mentioned in the presentation earlier that we don't have a reserve for solid waste. If we had one, would that reserve be applicable to covering increases like this in recycling or solid waste? Because I know a lot of the time, when the contract comes up, it doesn't usually go down. So if we had a reserve for that, would that be able to cover costs like this on a one-time basis?
So recycling is done in the universal budget because it's not it's not a user fee based thing, so it would be separate.
Okay.
So if we had reserves here that we want to use for that, that's different.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Bailey?
Yeah, a couple of questions. First, for the 11 firefighters, when you're recalculating, are you going to be recalculating at the first 6-month wage?
These would be the 6-month wage. They're done. We do the calculation to show.
Because they'll all be probationary for the period of this.
Yeah.
Okay, can you explain what this removal of COVID restart grant is? That's almost 5%.
So last year, we had a restart grant from the government for $7.6 million to offset costs. All municipalities received it and many other businesses as well. So we brought that into revenue, but that revenue is a one-time source of revenue. So it's not available. So it went into our base budget. Now we have to take it out of our base budget as a revenue source.
I'm more than a little confused by this. It's a
Might
huge,
need to go over
to
it
me,
again, Ms. Ruff.
it's a huge chunk of this budget. It's almost 5%. And yeah, I wonder if I could get that explained more specifically, maybe not now. But when I see a single line item hitting it pretty well 5%, it kind of gets my attention.
Mr. Backen?
So it might be best to think of it as a household. If one was operating a household and if all of a sudden there was a reduction in revenue or wages because of COVID, people couldn't work, the government gave you a grant of $500 for your budget for that year, you'd be balanced. But if that grant doesn't go through in perpetuity, the next year then you're gonna see that you're $500 short. In this case, for the municipality, we're not $500 short. We are, I got my glasses on, but we're that number actually short. So we now have to recover that. We have to, if you will, earn more wages or whatnot, and that brings us to some of the cost drivers because we have to replace that money this year because we're not getting it this year.
So we replace some of it theoretically with the line above it, which is the return of the recreation revenue, which is some of the impacts of COVID, right? So it's coming back, but in this year, that source isn't there.
And how much more is there to go in terms of return of recreation revenue back to pre-COVID levels in terms of a line item?
1.896, the same
So there's
number.
another
Yeah.
1.896 that would hopefully be there next year.
Correct.
With the 7.6 million not there.
Correct.
Is that correct? So I just want to clarify that. Councillor Martins?
Yeah, sorry, like Councillor Bailey, I was a little perplexed by this one. Is it typical when we know it's a one-time grant to put it here in this area of the budget? Because it doesn't artificially inflate what our revenue is? Like, it's great that it's a grant, but why is it being calculated here? And then it gets pulled out and it looks like we've taken a significant dip.
It's a one-time funding source, so you're trying to offset where you're missing revenues, right? So I'm not sure.
I could always try to answer. I think what we had, to be blunt, is a council in the previous term that used this to maintain a 3-point-something tax increase. You may not put it that way, but some could put it that way.
Correct, we did use it too.
Yeah, with the expectation that in future years, recreation revenue would return and offset the one-time use of this grant. It has not returned to the level anticipated by the previous politicians.
Thank you.
Carry on.
So we've been looking for some reductions in the budget to help us through, obviously, towards our objectives. So Transportation looked and said that they could take a one-time, again, this is one time, so would go away next year, $1.5 million in paving decrease, and they could decrease some landscaping, boulevard landscaping, I believe it was, for $230,000, and then arbitrary, and this completely arbitrary, would be to use prior year surplus to make up that remaining 1.9 million in recreation revenue, which will be back in the 2024 budget. Again, arbitrary items. So that gets us from the 9.6 to the 7.29% where we currently are.
Councillor Richter?
So I just want to make sure that I understand this. So we've started with our list here that's a 9.6% increase. We've dropped it 2.34, so it's now 7.29. But council passed a resolution that it be 4%. So we have a structural problem here.
I believe you addressed that on the next slide. Is that correct? Yeah.
So we're looking for direction, obviously, and I think Mr. Backen addressed that at the beginning. that we do have some funding requirements, shortfalls, et cetera. So we are looking for about $5.1 million to bring us to that 4% budget target. That can be in the form, take a number of forms at this point, but input is appreciated.
Councilor Richter? Is that
No, I'm just saying 7.3% is a lot higher than 4%.
any suggestions that any members of council have on assisting with the process that staff have taken would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I think this is where if we had had a group planning session on priorities, we might not be in this situation today.
Ms. Ruff, how many council priorities identified since the election are currently listed in this budget, resulting in a 9.68% tax increase? 0?
I don't, yeah,
Roughly 0?
other than the fire.
Fire.
Correct. So I think
Yeah.
that would be good to highlight that. But
Yeah.
to suggest that somehow this is a result of not having a strategic planning session, I'm not sure the logic there, Councilor Richter.
Well, I guess we have different ways of viewing logic.
Carry on.
So staff have been looking through budget. Obviously, these are all items that we have not included in the budget, but looking for ideas and just trying to generate some discussion. We have been talking about changes to the reserves and doing that, and these are still a bit rough numbers because we haven't worked through all the details, could reduce our internal debt payments and then save some funds that we're currently using to cover those internal debt payments. There are a number of transfers to reserves that we do, and one of them is we transfer funds to the Climate Action Reserve Fund, but now we're replacing, should be funds in CACs, so that's actually $549,000 that goes each year to that. There's also a number of small ones. I was just looking at agricultural viability. We transfer $135,000 a year. We generally spend about $100 in that area, so that's an option. Other small service changes, or a lot of it's really around outside contracts, et cetera, or it's a bunch of small things, maybe around $485,000. The Willoughby and the Willowbrook Rec Centers are still not open. Those are about $300,000 and $350,000. Those are very round numbers on those two, I will say. So just to generate some ideas and some options, and just to get some discussion.
Yeah, I have a question I have two questions here. Eliminate utility savings transfer to climate action. So what are the utility savings that you're referring to specifically there?
So the idea around the Climate Action Reserve Fund was that we would be doing projects that would save us money in utilities at the buildings, et cetera. So we take those savings that we calculate each year and we put them into a reserve to be used for climate action projects.
Okay, so we would have an alternative funding source for those initiatives now inside the CAC program, potentially. Maybe with some bridge mechanism required until that CAC revenue begins to flow into that specific reserve account. So I appreciate bringing this forward. Agricultural viability reserve, I don't recall seeing that on the reserve list, but maybe it's there, but I don't recall seeing it.
I believe it's there. It's not huge.
Okay, 35,000. It's not huge, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I think I'll maybe follow up on that. Other service changes, is that a nice way of saving service level reductions? Just want to be clear that that's what it may be, right?
It could be.
Could be.
It could be. I mean, I didn't dig very deep, looking sort of at consulting fees and things where we maybe have a little bits and pieces of budget that aren't being used and haven't been used.
Okay. I appreciate, again, I really appreciate bringing those forward and identifying those. And if any member of council wants to dig in a little further, that could be provided to all of council, specifically what might be in there. Mr. Bracken, do you have something?
Your worship, just to pick on that line, because that can be reduced or it could be dramatically increased by deciding that there's a certain service that we no longer wish to provide. Recycling was an example. We would never obviously do that, but recycling, we could decide that we're not going to provide recycling anymore, and that will provide a significant savings then in terms of our budget. But there may be other service levels that are historical that are better represented by past needs as opposed to current needs or the priorities that we're now looking at. Yeah, so I think that would be helpful to see what's in that 485. I mean, I'll flag that for myself. Other members of council want it, they can certainly distribute that to them as well. The Willoughby Recreation Center closure, is that purely from a salaries and wages perspective, or is there some operating impact
that is also related to capital items that maybe we're seeing in that reduction, or is that sort of a loose number that might need more work if we proceed with that?
It would need more work, but yes, it's salaries and wages, but there's facility operating, cleaning contracts, maintenance contracts on equipment, et cetera, so, yeah.
Great. Councillor Ferguson?
Yeah, just back to Willoughby Recreation Center. Now, we also had that facility used by, I guess, Fraser Health or something during the COVID. Is that still being used, and did we generate some revenues from that?
I believe their term is coming to an end. In terms of revenues, I think they covered the operating costs, but I don't believe they provided any more. Mr. Winsley?
Your Worship, correct on the operating portion. They've wrapped up at the end of December, so December 31st they finished, and they've returned to a model where you can visit your local doctors or pharmacies or things for shots.
That more like, if I may, more like a kind of I guess, a benefit that we were providing to our citizens and other surrounding community citizens that basically, I guess, would they cost for service or something rather than a lease or something?
As far as Fraser Health, when you remember the mass immunizations that began, they looked for centers. We actually used the arena during that portion of time. And then in each community, they tried to identify, or regionally, I guess, they tried to identify a center that could continue to provide good access as people got third shots, fourth shots, kids were able to get shots. So they had great success there in central Willoughby, good location. So they continued offering that service, but now they've gone away from not just Langley, but all of their regional centers. Now they've gone to a different model.
Thank you, and I know I wanted to compliment staff and the public were very, very happy with that and excellent. The processes and location and everything else, people were very, very happy with that center. Thank you.
Councillor Bailey?
The Willoughby and the Willowbrook Recreation Center closures, so these buildings are not being utilized right now? Am I correct?
There's some vacant space.
Yeah, Mr. Back, maybe address the status of those two locations a little bit further.
So Willowbrook is the one in this building, and Willoughby is the one up at the LEC. So those are centers that are focusing on fitness and some other collateral support. At the present time, they remain closed, and what these numbers represent is really our operating subsidy, generally speaking, for those centers when they're actually operating. So by not having them open at the moment, we're saving money, but that doesn't mean we maintain the best service levels that we're actually seeing. Other uses of them could be considered, or we could return. Now, if we do return, in fact, our plan is to return to them, but our major issue now is staffing levels to find them, because where we do have probably our most dramatic shortages is going to be in the area of, I guess, recreational people that are part-time or auxiliary that are there to actually supply the oversight and the training for the residents.
Thank you.
Councillor Van Popte?
Is there a way that we could get a list of funding envelopes that are just kind of like in each department for certain items?
We don't really have funding envelopes. I mean, we have budget line items, which are, kind of in your package, I would say.
Okay. Can we get more detailed line items for each department? Or at least maybe in infrastructure and development and...
Yeah, I mean, you could probably, there'd be some more work to be done on the budget structure, maybe have that outlined a bit more clearly. Yeah, there's not really funding envelopes other than for things that are, I think, held open, like property acquisition and things like that. Those would be more identified envelopes that don't require a budget bylaw amendment. Mr. Beck, do you want to give some more context to maybe what difference between a budget line item and an envelope?
Perhaps, Sandra, you can actually begin with the budget line items, because I think what we're referencing is the budget line items billed to these totals, and we're presenting the totals. But there may be, let's use wages, for example. If there's 100 positions in one area, they would bill to the total amount. Each wage would be dependent upon, I guess, if it was a union staff member, of course, a collective agreement. If it's exempt staff member, based on their contracts that are in place as they go forward. So they would all be specific, I guess, line items within that department that would then build within the division, that would then build within the utility or in the township itself. Is that
Yes, so when you say envelopes, I mean, it's a massive amount of line items that have been budgeted to run the municipality. So it's not, it's not easy to identify specific things that might just be envelopes. I mean, basically, if you look in our budget package, we break everything down by say wages, and Mr. Backen's correct in that that has detail behind it for every single position and
Yeah,
body
no,
that goes
yeah.
into it, right? So again, you would also have, you know, like special contracts we talked about, service and maintenance contracts are a myriad of different types of contracts that we have, from mowing, you know, the biggest one because we have gas with that, but, you know, cleaning contracts.
Yeah, I guess
lot
it would
of
just
them.
be neat to see kind of how things are distributed. So when I see a maintenance, you know, maintenance line item, how much of that is being spent on this type of maintenance versus that type of maintenance, so that, you know, if there's a way for us to start, you know, doing things differently, or, you know, building things better so that we're spending less on maintenance in this area, like just to kind of break things down a little bit more. Or,
I mean, a starting point would be in the budget package, because we break it down by division. That's kind of a bit of a starting point to see, you know, how much do we spend on maintenance and recreation? How much do we spend on maintenance and transportation in particular, right? That might
yeah.
be a starting point.
Okay.
From a,
Councillor Richter, I'm just going to mention the software is putting others in front because they've spoken fewer times, but I've overridden that. Just go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Why is the software overriding?
It's saying that, well, you've spoken 14 times versus others, so it's just putting people in front of you, but I'll override that here. I'll clear the queue. Go ahead.
I've spoken 14 times. Am I not allowed to speak
No,
14
you certainly
times?
are, but I'm bypassing that so you can speak now before Councillor
Oh, well,
Kuntz,
thank you very much.
who came in after you.
I just wanted to make a note that I think the climate action item is really important to be maintained. And in fact, one of the things that I want to flag for additional discussion is the need for us to perhaps look at putting more money into reserves for severe weather events, or what are now being called costly weather events. I noted with a great deal of interest yesterday on the TV that in the last 2 weeks alone, $1 billion in California has been spent on a severe weather event. And there have been 18 $1 billion events in the U.S. over 2022. And essentially what's happening in the U.S., I don't know if Canada keeps the same stats, but we're seeing $1 billion weather damage events occurring every 18 days now, as opposed to every 82 days in the 1980s. So I think the township needs to be cognizant of this, and I think we need to prepare in case we're hit with that type of a costly severe weather event as well. So we need to protect the township. Anyway, if I could flag that for additional discussion. Thank you.
Councillor Kuntz, go ahead.
I noticed on the agenda that we have an agenda about snow removal and the significant costs to the budget. Where would we, if this, you know, actually passes, where would we actually see that in this budget?
so that has not been taken into account in this budget
Okay,
yet, because that has not been before
Right.
council. So
right. So should that pass, would we see that in this budget, or would that be something that we maybe talk about at the council table when the agenda kind of cuts up?
it would be timing, right? Whether it's 2023, 2024, or implementation timing.
Right, okay, so, but that's snow removal, that would not be on here yet. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ferguson?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I think some good points made by other members of council. I mean, we all know that climate change and other these challenges regarding catastrophes, that would be something that perhaps members of council can present in policy motions to the Lower Mainland Local Government Association, UBCM, FCM, or MLAs and MPs. So that's like a national issue that we should, because where Langley suffers, all communities suffer. So it's something that both federal and provincial governors and regional governments should be aware of. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, carry on, Ms. Rowe.
I would just make a comment on that. We are seeing increases in our stormwater budget requirements, partly due to some of these events. So last item that we have in detail, of this sort of detail, is the list of discretionary items. So we always, when we go out to staff, we ask for non-discretionary, which was our previous list, and discretionary items. We have not included these in the budget. I have listed them because they are there. They were things that staff may have been thinking about. Again, they go back to what services we want to provide and what our priorities are. But we list them there. The one I will point out is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead. That was referred to previously because it was referred to the budget.
I have one question here. The second from the bottom, the RFT arborist, 2 positions. The number looks low for 2 positions, so maybe you could explain what that
I
means.
suspect that's half year.
Half year, so that would be an
suspect, yeah.
annualized item, but you know,
Would have
maybe
to
you
be
can double check that, because I believe that is a growing need for the township. Councillor Pratt?
Thank you. If I could just draw everybody's attention to the city studio, there's the 2 line items, auxiliary salaries, and then both regarding the Intelligent Community Initiative. Could you just give us some detail on what that is? If
We
you're
can bring
able
that
to.
back.
Thank you.
Okay, carry on.
Okay. So then we also have one-times in our universal budget. So we have a number of items in here. We list all the ones greater than $50,000. The first one is municipal top-up for climate action rebate program. So there are rebate offered by Clean BC and BC Hydro, and the municipality can offer a top-up to those, and I think they're generally for EV chargers and heat pumps. Culvert cleaning program, so this was as a result of the 2021 atmospheric river, so we are getting funding for that for $225,000, but need $25,000. Standards to cover accreditation is through the fire, and it's to define our risks and capabilities. Set up moving costs for the new museum. So we need to move into the new museum and the cost to move the exhibits, etc. It is TOL's 150th anniversary in 2023, therefore there was a request for some funding for some special events. Building safer communities is just, it's all coming out of grants, but we run it through a one-time process. There is some need to update the subdivision and development servicing bylaw based on some new bylaws, I believe, for $100,000 for some consulting fees. We, every year, bring back a corporate operating contingency in case we need it as a budget envelope line item. Also a salary and wage contingency in case we don't have enough in our previous year's accruals. And again, another envelope is just repayment of internal LAS loan. And then there's a number of smaller items.
Councillor Richter?
Together.
Yeah, a couple of questions here. The moving costs for the new museum, was that not budgeted in the initial museum?
No.
No.
Could I offer to do it myself for $300,000?
This is obviously an envelope and may move up or down, but you know, these are exhibits. I'm assuming they need special handling.
Curious how moving across the street with a building of that size, I mean, maybe the contents are more than I realized, and maybe there are special considerations, but I did see this as a rather generous envelope to move items, move chattel items. We could maybe get that refined a bit more.
And
Go back.
which contingency of $404,000. How likely is it going to be that we need this? Have we ever used it before?
I don't believe so, but we are in labor negotiations and we may not have accrued enough in previous years.
Yeah, well, for example, in the police situation, I know we've been putting money faithfully away every year to cover
This
those
is for
increases.
salary and wages, not to do with external contracts.
Okay. I just wonder if we need that large an amount. So can we flag it and discuss it later? Thank you. And the internal LAS loan, what's that?
It's just an envelope in case we need to do an LAS loan during the year, so it's budget authority essentially.
Thank you.
Councillor Rampapto, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
You sure? Okay. Councillor Bailey?
You have to excuse this question might be a little off. This is the first time I've gone through this one stuff, but when I hear the climate action stuff come up all the time, do they ever break out down the additional costs, and I'm meaning more overtime costs, to emergency services that are incurred by situations like the flooding? And anytime there is a very significant climate action occurrence, do they ever break out the additional cost to emergency services at that time?
Anytime that we can apply for disaster financial assistance from the provincial government, we would definitely have those broken out.
Thank you.
Okay. So then just circle back on the library levy. So again, because it's a separate item on the tax statement, we have the increase in the contract, which we had discussed previously, which now we're broken out the staffing, additional staffing in Fort Langley, and the Brookswood expansion. And then in the previous year, we had established a library reserve fund so that we have money to pull when we need to replace furniture, et cetera, within the library itself. So we put $250 in last year. We're potentially looking at adding another $250, and then that would be a $500 contribution each year. And then we obviously have facility cost escalations, just general cleaning, et cetera, utilities, to get to our levy.
Councillor Rampapto, go ahead.
How many libraries do we have?
Too many?
We actually have to go through each area to recite them. So Aldergrove, Murrayville, Brookswood, Walnut Grove, Fort Langley, and Willoughby.
Okay.
Sorry,
So
Willowbrook.
one per community, essentially.
Generally speaking.
So with this additional $250,000, we would have $500,000 reserved for upgrade of furniture and things like that.
And this would be an annual contribution.
It would be an
added to the-
annual contribution.
Added to the base of the levy, Councillor Rampapto.
Yeah.
So it would go in every year to the reserve to be used.
Okay, that's a lot of furniture.
Keeping in mind, though, I
Libraries
believe that was,
Go ahead.
so it was kept to FF&E, the new library in Fort Langley. So that's going to be probably several $1 million. So I think this was actually providing the process to make sure we had money to start that process and as well to refurbish other libraries. I'm just saying that's why I think it's so large.
Councillor Ferguson, do you have anything still? No? Okay, carry on.
Okay.
So with 10 minutes left, how much time you think you need for the capital budget portion? We could do a small extension, but I think if this is going to be, Mr. Backen potentially could schedule another one of these at the council meeting on the 30th to finalize the capital budget presentation, same concept.
Yep, that would
Thoughts
work.
on that? So if any other members of council have any other question about operating, we could resume and complete the capital presentation on the 30th. Any objections or thoughts on that? No. So I'll get a motion to terminate. Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Bailey. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? Great, carried unanimously. Thank you again for the presentation. I very much appreciate that. And I'm sure we'll have many, many follow-ups in a couple of weeks ahead. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.